there is a right way and a wrong way to approach being vulnerable at work. The wrong way is to just talk about the gaps that you have. Now, it's good to have that level of psychological safety where you feel like you can show up to work to talk about those gaps. But the right way to actually approach it is to talk about the gap and what you're trying to do to close it, regardless of what that gap is, regardless if it's a mistake that you made, regardless if you're addressing your employees as a first-time leader and the message that you deliver. There is a right way and there is a wrong way to approach it. And when we looked at the data, what we saw is that the more senior you get inside of an organization, the less likely you are to show a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me.
When you go from mid to senior level leadership, it drops off a cliff completely, which is unfortunate. And we also found that the number one reason that people do not want to show any kind of vulnerability at work is because they don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent. And so the solution to that is you demonstrate competence with the vulnerability. And there's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect, which basically states that there's this very strong relationship between vulnerability and competence. And what that means is that if you are highly competent, you're good at your job, and then you display vulnerability, you are viewed as being more likable. You are being viewed as more capable. You get a little bit of a 1 + 1 = 3 effect. And that's because you've already demonstrated your competence. And now the vulnerability makes you seem more human. And now somebody looks at you and they say, oh, wow, so-and-so, they're really good at their job. Wow, they're also like a human being now. I like that. So you get a little bit of a boost. But the flip side of that is also true. If you are not good at your job and you're demonstrating vulnerability and you're constantly showing up to work talking about the gaps that you have, the mistakes that you made, the challenges, tough time this, and you're not good at your job, it reinforces your mediocrity.
Yeah.
And so now people are going to look at you and they're going to say, yeah, I get why you're not getting promoted. I get why you're not closing those deals. Right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be good at everything. It means that you need to demonstrate that you're trying to close your gaps. Right? So if you're a first-time leader, there's going to be a lot of things that you don't know how to do. But you don't go in front of your employees and say, hey, I'm a first-time leader. I'm really nervous. But I know we're going to have some amazing things happen. Yay, go team. That doesn't really inspire much confidence. Instead, you go in front of your employees as a first-time leader and you say, hey, you could start with the vulnerability. Hey, I'm a first-time leader. I'm a little nervous. I've never done this before, but here's what I'm going to do to make sure that I'm the best leader that you've ever had. Here's some books that I'm reading. I'm working with an executive coach. One of the leaders at this company is going to be meeting with me once every week or once every month to be reviewing my leadership style. My door is always going to be open for you for feedback. So I'm acknowledging I've never done this before, but I'm also demonstrating to you what I'm trying to do to close that gap to make sure that I can be amazing at whatever it is that I'm doing. So it doesn't mean you actually need to be amazing at it, but at least demonstrate that you're trying to get there. You are learning, you are growing and trying to become a better version.
Yeah, a lot of people end up sharing the gap and using it as, hey, this is an innate character trait that I possess that I cannot rid myself of. I'm just not good at Excel. Well, you're a quant analyst, so you got to be good at Excel, dude.
Hurry up,
you better learn it. This is just my little quirk. And when they do that, that's frustrating for coworkers. It's frustrating even more so when that person is in a leadership authority over us, because it's like, oh my gosh, my leader's coming and telling me he stinks at this thing. Guess who's got to pick it up? Me. And now I got to pick up the slack. He's not doing anything about it. And whenever I have a gap, he's not going to react that way. He's not going to say, oh, well, you're just bad at that element of your job, because
you don't get that grace.
I don't get the grace and I don't have anybody to boot it over to. So it makes so much sense to me when you say, Jacob, hey, we've got to acknowledge as a leader, hey, this is my shortcoming, but this is where I'm improving. When have you seen someone do that really, really well?
Yeah. And by the way, just to add on to your point really quick, no leader, if you go to your leader and talk about a failure or a mistake or whatever, no leader is going to look at you and say, okay, thank you for telling me. On the inside, the leader is still going to be wondering like, okay, but the problem is still there. The customer is still unhappy. The goal still hasn't been met. The revenue numbers have still not been achieved. We're still behind schedule. So your leader is not going to just assume that, okay, you came forward with that. Thanks, you get a pass. Go on your merry way and I'll take care of it. Your leader is going to look at you and say, okay, and? Thank you for telling me, and? What are you doing about it? And that's the challenge that we see. We are not adding that action piece to it, which I think we need to do a much better job of. So, there are two stories that I talk about in the book. There's lots of stories, but I open the book with two stories. One from Hollis Harris, the former CEO of Continental Airlines, and one from the CEO of a company called Sasol. In Hollis Harris, in the late 80s, early 90s, a company was going through a tough time, and his board asked him to send out a memo to his workforce. So he sends out a memo to the almost 40,000 employees, and he talks about the challenges that the business is going through, the tough, turbulent economic times. And he ends his memo by telling his employees that the best thing they could do is to pray for the future of the company. Very vulnerable thing to say.
That's a deathbed statement.
Yep. The next day he gets fired. So vulnerability for a leader is not the same as it is for a non-leader, because you have a unique position. I also interviewed the CEO of American Airlines. He told me there would be many times where he would sit alone in his car during the pandemic, pumping himself up and getting himself excited and optimistic before he would show up to work, because he knew that all of his employees were watching and reading the news talking about how American Airlines was going bankrupt. And in those times and in those situations, he couldn't show up to work being vulnerable and talking about, I don't know, maybe the company's going to disappear. Maybe you won't have a job. He would show up to work saying, you know what, we're going to be fine. He could not show that vulnerability in those times. Now, Fleetwood Grobler, as I mentioned, the former CEO of Sasol, when he took over, the company was $13 billion in debt. The banks were about to come in and repossess the business. He also had to give a town hall meeting to his employees, and his message was very different. Now, he started off with vulnerability, talking about the challenges, that the company was in debt, that he didn't know how they were going to get out of this mess. And then he added the leadership and said, I have a vision for where this business can go. And I know that we can turn things around and rebuild trust in the eyes of our employees and in our customers. And if you come with me on this journey and help me figure out that path forward, I know that we can turn this business around and become successful. So he was vulnerable, but he added the leadership piece in there. So it's okay when there is vulnerability, but ask yourself, how can I add leadership to it?